Hello, welcome to U.S. History 1860 to 1940. My name is Amy Colon. I'll be your instructor this semester. This is our very first video, and technically this class is going to start with the American Civil War era. But before we can talk about the Civil War, we need to talk about what led up to the Civil War. So we're going to start with the impending crisis before 1860 and a little bit about the tension rising between the North and the South. So that's where we're going to start today. Why was there developing tension between the North and the South in the 1850s? Mainly, that is because the North and South developed very differently by the 1850s. By the 1850s, the northern states had largely abolished slavery. The states in the north were more urban. There was more industry in the north, less reliance on farming, and the farms in the north were much smaller, and less vast than the ones in the south. The South, on the other hand, relied on slave labor. It was much more rural than the North. It relied more on farming economy, was more agricultural, and there were more larger farms that were focused on cash crops like cotton, rice, tobacco. Now, by the late 1850s, Southerners started to fear that the U.S. government may ban slavery in the near future, which in the long run would hurt the South economically. And you might wonder, well, why was the South concerned about this in the 1850s? Well, partly because since the 1830s, there was a growing number of Northerners that were becoming what's called an abolitionist. I'm going to put that up here on the outline. Next to slavery issue. Abolitionists. Abolitionists are mainly Northerners. There could be Southerners who were abolitionists, but they mainly would leave the South to become an abolitionist. But an abolitionist wanted to abolish slavery immediately with no compensation to the slave owner. And the abolitionist movement grew since the 1830s in northern states. And it was led by a man named William Lloyd Garrison in the beginning, and as time went on, he published a newsletter that promoted the creation of anti-slavery societies around the North. And by the time we get to the 1850s, there are hundreds of anti-slavery organizations in the North, and many, many Northerners are becoming active in the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement was concerning to the South and slave owners in the West because it was growing in number, and their demand was for the immediate abolishment of slavery in the country with no compensation to the slave owners. So for slave owners, that was concerning because they felt that would economically devastate their farms. So Southerners were concerned that with the rise of abolitionists by the 1850s in the North, that they eventually would convince Congress to pass a law outlawing slavery. And they started to feel that the national government was too powerful and that the government may eventually use its power to outlaw slavery. So there is a twofold issue going on here that leads us to the Civil War. Obviously, the slavery issue is dividing the North and South, and the South is concerned that the country is moving away from slavery, which they feel will economically harm them. But then there's the states' rights issue. So you can't argue these two are not connected. The states' rights issue is a concern, especially in the South, that the national government has become too powerful, and they promote what's called states' rights. They want to go back to a time where the states had more power than the national government, like we did under the Articles of Confederation back in the early days of the Republic. However, you can't separate these two issues. What is the South afraid the government is going to do with its power? Abolish slavery. So, yes, the war is about states' rights, but that is directly linked to their fear that the government is going to outlaw slavery. So, Those are the two main reasons why the Civil War began. It's the issue of slavery and the issue of states' rights. And the South fear that the government is too powerful and they're eventually going to create a federal ban on slavery, which they feel will economically hurt them. All right, so the event that allowed tension to come to a head and kind of set us up for the Civil War was the presidential election of 1860. And there were two main political parties in the U.S. at this time, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And yes, those are the same two parties that we have today. So, the Republican Party nominated to run for president Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, lawyer from Illinois, ran for president as a Republican. And the Republicans chose Lincoln because he became nationally known when he ran for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858 against Stephen A. Douglas. And in that race, Douglas and Lincoln debated each other seven times throughout the campaign. It was covered by newspapers. And of course, they debated the slavery issue, which was a huge issue at the time. And although they both opposed slavery, they had slightly different views of slavery. And Abraham Lincoln did not think that slavery should be allowed to move to the West, to the Western territories. He feared that if slavery spread west, it would be part of the United States for a long time. He saw slavery as possibly growing and becoming more part of the U.S. if we allow it to spread to the West. So he opposed slavery spreading to the West because he felt it was evil and he didn't want it to become a permanent part of the country. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He never called for slavery to be abolished in the South, which is what abolitionists wanted, because he knew that would have caused a civil war. Lincoln tried to be practical. So he opposed slavery moving westward. He never was an abolitionist, though. Stephen A. Douglas wasn't as concerned about slavery as Lincoln, and he wasn't concerned about it moving westward because he felt slavery in the long run will die out because it isn't as successful as a free labor system. Now, in the end of that race, Lincoln lost the Senate race, but the debates made him well known across the country, and that's led the Republican Party to choose Abraham Lincoln to run for president in 1860. The Democratic Party split in the election of 1860 between the North and the South. Southern Democrats, who want to protect slavery, and they hope it will spread to the Western territories so that there be more representatives in Congress that represent slave states. They chose John C. Breckinridge, who supported slavery, to run for president. The Northern Democrats, who were not supportive of slavery and did not want it to see spread west, chose Stephen A. Douglas to run for president. So you see the Democratic Party splits between the North and the South over the issue of slavery in the presidential election of 1860. That split in the Democratic Party helped Abraham Lincoln win the election because all the Republicans voted for Lincoln, whereas not all the Democrats voted for Breckinridge or Douglas. They split their vote. And that helped Lincoln win a victory. And it wasn't a huge victory, but it was a victory. He won more electoral votes in that election. Let's talk about Lincoln's presidency. Before Lincoln even took the oath of office, South Carolina held a secession convention in December of 1860. So the election was in November of 1860. And then South Carolina held a secession convention to talk about leaving the Union. They voted unanimously to leave the Union, the delegates at that secession convention. And there were two reasons why South Carolina decided to leave the Union. One was to protect slavery. They feared Lincoln was going to support an anti-slavery law. And the second issue was states' rights. They believed state government should have more power than the federal government. And the South was really feared the federal government will outlaw slavery with its power. They looked at Lincoln as a secret abolitionist, even though he wasn't an abolitionist. By February of 1861, other states followed South Carolina. So I have them listed here. Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi all left the Union, and they created a new country called the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president, Jefferson Davis. They wrote their own constitution, which is loosely based on the U.S. Constitution, with two main differences. In the Confederate Constitution, slavery was legal, and the states had more power than the federal government. So before Lincoln even took the oath of office, the nation was divided. So that's where I'm going to leave this video. We'll pick up with Lincoln's president and how the war began in the next video.